Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in another wonderful BookTuber tag. This is the music or no music book tag, and it's a tag that was created by Robert G., reader of books, and I was tagged to take part in the fun by Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics, and by David at David Novak Reads Poetry. There are 7 prompts, so let's get straight into it. Prompt 1. Do you listen to music while you read? Usually no. Of course it does depend also on what type of book it is. But if I'm reading poetry, for example, I could not read poetry while any music was on at all. You know, you want to just get lost in the words, the flow of the language. And, you know, you want to listen to those alliterations and the use of rhyme if there is end-line rhyme and, you know, internal rhyme within a line. And more importantly for me, because what I mostly read, of course, is contemporary poetry, what is really more important for me is that flow, the rise and fall of syllables within a line. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily be a literative verse, but there is always, isn't there? You know, there is always that rise and fall of syllables, that ti-tum, 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 if it's a regular rise and fall, or, you know, a more irregular, looser fall. But either way, there's, you know, poetry, I think, always has a real ear for the musicality of language. And I would not be able to really give myself over to that experience and really enter into it properly if I had music on in the background. So if I was reading poetry, no music at all. I like it as quiet as possible. You know, I'm not a fascist. I don't insist that everyone is silent because, you know, the man is reading. I've never been like that. I had 4 children, so for most of my adult life, I have read with much going on in the background, and it was never a problem. I would never had a problem like Stravinsky with having to compose or write or read in silence. I never tried to insist on that in my household. But now that I live just quietly with Billy, you know, Billy's a greyhound, so he's almost non-vocal. So usually now I've certainly got into the patterns now of reading in very much a quiet, gentle, quiet, you know, space. But no, yes, I don't always read without music on. I have bought recently a lot of books on the operas of Richard Wagner. Wagner's a composer I just love. And I'm new to opera, so I don't know much about it. So I have bought a lot of things, you know, biographies of Wagner and critical introductions to the operas, you know, and references back to the Nordic mythology of the ring cycle and all that sort of thing. And I must admit, I love reading this stuff on Wagner while I've got Wagner playing in the background. I wouldn't be able to read the stuff on Wagner with Wagner being played in a headset. That would just be too closed in and close, I think. But if, you know, Wagner is on in the background in this space in my tiny home, I love that immersive experience of listening to Wagner while reading about the operas. I found that to be just very immersive and wonderful. And then, of course, there are other works of non-fiction as well. You know, if you really are only reading a book for its contents, for its meaning, well then yes, I could probably listen to music while reading. But it would have to be music with no lyrics, with no voice. I would find it way too difficult to be reading, you know, one thing while there was voice in music in the background. So, you know, if I was listening to a great symphony, if it was completely instrumental American bluegrass, you know, something like that, any sort of music, classical music or American bluegrass music that was 100% instrumental, I would certainly enjoy listening to that while I was reading some works of non-fiction. But if it's a really beautifully written work of non-fiction and I really want to give myself, as I said before, to that flow of language, to that dance, that rise and fall of the syllables, I would probably prefer to read then in quiet. But for some reason, when I'm listening to Richard Wagner, or when I'm reading about Richard Wagner, I do love the immersive experience of having everything on in the background. And that just adds to the joy and the fun, the wonder for me. So there you go. Prompt 2. Is there a special kind of music you prefer when reading? Well, as I said, it would have to be music that had no voice in it, no lyrics. So it would have to be instrumental music. And for me, the only music I really listen to is acoustic music. In particular, I listen to some opera, but I am very new to opera. I am trying to educate myself into it and to tune my ear to it a little bit. So I've got my toes in the water of opera, but I love symphonies in particular. Musical suites like Holst's The Great Planet Suite, but symphonies in particular I just love. And I now have really, the last decade, I've been listening to more and more American bluegrass. So for me, is there a special kind of music that I prefer? Well, yes, it is typically acoustic music, and for me that is typically classical music or American bluegrass. That's what I mostly listen to. 3, is there a particular kind of music you would never listen to when you read? As my family would tell you, I am quite allergic to pop music. I don't have any of the wonderful references, that most people have when they listen to the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or even ABBA or whatever. I don't have the wonderful reference points to, I remember what I was doing when I first heard this song or when I first bought it or encountered it or, I don't have any of those references. Growing up as a teenager, I only listened to American Christian music. I grew up in a very devout, very naive Baptist family. Wonderful people, wonderful, loving people, and it was a wonderful family. But we only listened to Christian music. So, with Mum, I would often listen, particularly on a Sunday morning before we went to church. We would be listening to the Statler Brothers or Burl Ives or maybe Johnny Cash. There are so many of the others as well, of course. And then as I grew into a teenager, my act of rebellion was maybe to replace Burl Ives and the Statler Brothers with Larry Norman or Randy Matthews, Randy Stonehill, Family, Evie. So as a teenager growing up, I only listened to American Christian music. So for me, I don't have any of those reference points. Listening to the Beatles or Rolling Stones, they don't echo back to my childhood or adolescence. They don't put me back into any fond memory place. And now, of course, American Christian music, oh my goodness. I would still describe myself as a Christian, but I am a very progressive left-of-centre Christian. The hypocrisy of Christian nationalism. So for me, pop music puts me back into popular Christian music, which just puts me into an antagonistic frame of mind with the current situation with American Christian nationalism. So for me, the references, the allusions, all the connotations, all the things that pop music in the background brings up to me, for me, they're all negative. They're all very antagonistic. So I am quite allergic to pop music, all of that sort of thing. Plus, also, when I was at Sydney University as a young adult, when I was really moving away from my more simple, naive Baptist faith, moving to something, a little more progressive and interesting for me, sorry. I had 2 lecturers at Sydney University who I just was so excited by. Ken McNabb and Craig Reynolds. They just turned my life around and blew my little Baptist mind right out of the water. They were great Marxist historians. Ken McNabb was a terrific historian of British Labour leaders and social theorists. So looking at that Marxist, that left-wing progressive centre in a sort of British context, if you like. And Craig Reynolds, he read very deeply into Marxist critical and theoretical principles, and he applied that reading of Marx to a reading of Southeast Asian history, in particular places like Cambodia and Thailand. And I just felt absolutely madly under the spell. Craig Reynolds and Ken McNabb, for me, were absolutely mesmerizing and magnetic. I just love them. And they, of course, turned me on to the Frankfurt School and to a reading of the Frankfurt School and, their reading of popular culture, the popular music industry, as just examples, again, of capitalism and of reinforcing the hegemony of capitalism. So for me also now, popular music, popular American music in particular, it really rubs me the wrong way in terms of my infatuation, my naive reading of things like the Frankfurt School. And of course, I still just love the Frankfurt School today. They didn't want to change the world. They had no program for revolutionary action. These were people, the Marxist, Jewish, German, Marxist thinkers who simply wanted to use Marx to understand the world. They had lost the fire in the belly to change it completely. Books that have come out recently, this is, if you're interested, I would really recommend it. This book by Stuart Jefferies, Grand Hotel Abyss, The Lives of the Frankfurt School. This reads like a popular work of fiction. It's just a grand narrative suite. It has all that narrative complication and momentum of the sequence of events. It's got humor in it. It makes such complicated ideas so readable. This is an absolutely marvelous introduction to the Frankfurt School. These mad group, this band of German Jewish intellectuals who nearly all migrated to Germany, fleeing, of course, the Nazi purge during that mid-20th century milieu. This is a fabulous book. But, Adorno, he also, didn't he? He wrote so much about this, and this wonderful book that he wrote, introducing the symphonic master program of Gustav Mahler. This is a fantastic book, and this is what I was talking about. The Frankfurt School have really done so much from looking at the psychology of commercialism, consumerism. They've applied Marxist critical analysis to a reading of capitalist hegemony and how the hegemony reinforces, reproduces itself. And for people like Adorno, the popular music industry, popular rock and roll, popular music was a major plank in this capitalist movement to reinforce itself, to impose its hegemony on top of everyone. I find their critique of popular culture quite profound, from the psychological principles of someone like Herbert Marcuse, and then, of course, looking more at the Marxist theoretical things of Adorno. And this book, this introduction to Mahler by Adorno, is just absolutely fabulous. This is a terrific book. I know Adorno does cop some flack because, maybe even he's a hypocrite. I don't know. He does cop some flack for not applying the same critical reading that he applied to American popular and rock and roll music to, of course, European classical music. For Adorno, European classical music was mostly the epitome of high culture. It was what it was all about. It was the revolutionary program for some reason. Whereas popular music and rock and roll was simply reinforcing the hegemony of American capitalism. It's interesting, isn't it? I guess there is some conflict of interest there. Why is European classical music so profoundly okay and American popular music not? But anyway, this is a terrific introduction to the works of Richard Mahler. I love it. There you go. So is there a particular kind of music you would never listen to? Yeah, well, popular music, rock and roll, anything like that. I'm really allergic to it. I don't like drum kits. I don't really like electrical music. I much more prefer acoustic music to be able to really hear the instrumentation and what the musician is doing, what they've given their life to. Just like I love poetry, I love music just as much. Music is a really important part of my life. But I don't like popular music for all the reasons I've just given you. Plus also, of course, as a poet, I find the repetitive nature of the lyrics and of the rhythms of popular music quite irritating. I don't like the fact that popular music so often doesn't know how to end itself other than to simply have the fade out. You know, that blanket rule that a popular song nearly always simply ends with a fade out. Again, I just find the repetitive, the mechanical nature of that quite irritating. So I don't like the heavy use of repetition, the rhyming lyrics, you know, that clunking heavy use of rhyme. Oh, it irritates me terribly. All right, 4. Do you read in silence? Well, yeah, as I said, it really depends what I'm reading. If I'm reading poetry, yes, as close to silent as possible, that would be fantastic. If I'm reading all this stuff on Richard Wagner, for some reason, the immersive experience of having him on in the background while I'm reading the biographies or these critical introductions, I just find an absolute hoot. So there you go. It's interesting, isn't it? I read some books in silence. I read other books with music on, and even quite loud as I think I can get away with anyway, so no one else has to listen to what I'm listening to. All right, 5, a scenario. You're reading in public and someone begins playing music. What is your reaction? Well, if I'm reading in public and I start to hear music, the odds are it's simply going to be popular music, isn't it? That's what's usually played in public. So I'm probably going to get irritated and move away if at all possible. So yeah, if I was doing that situation, I would probably stop reading and move away so I didn't have to listen to it. I hate being forced to listen to popular music everywhere I go. I find the Beatles, ABBA, any of that sort of stuff, it is for me as irritating as A Christmas Carol by the time you get to December 25. But that's just me. I'm probably wrong. Does it matter whether music is playing? Well, I think I've answered that question, haven't I? I can read some books with music, some books without music. Poetry, which is my biggest love, of course, in terms of reading, I have to have as close as possible to silence so that I can really give myself to the musicality, to the dance, the rise and fall of those syllables within a line. I just love it. But yes, I have to be able to listen to, when I'm reading poetry, I often read it out loud to myself so I can literally be hearing it. I find that is a much better way, particularly if it's a work of poetry that is new to me, that I'm encountering for the first time. And a lot of people, you know, contemporary poetry often doesn't rhyme. It often doesn't maybe even use heavy alliteration or anything else. So a lot of people see a lot of contemporary poetry as being very flat. But for me personally, you know, I don't think I've ever read any contemporary poetry that is not a real play with the rise and fall of those syllables within a line. And for me, there is still a great musicality within contemporary poetry. And I think you need to often read it out loud to really appreciate what the poet is trying to do with their poetics and to get that real dance of the rise and fall of the syllables going within a line. Certainly is how I write my poetry. My poetry needs to be. It is much better read out loud and listened to. All right. I will tag some people down below, but I thought I might also just read one poem for you. This is a poem from my current collection of work called Cactus. Cactus is a work that I wrote while I was living in Melbourne, and it's a work that is basically all a work of confessional, ekphrastic poetry. And here's a poem that I wrote celebrating my love for American bluegrass. And in particular, this poem, the trigger for this poem, is an American bluegrass band called Punch Brothers that features this magnificent young bloke called Chris Thile. If there is one person in the world who I am addicted to, who I would love to meet, one of these other people for me who I find absolutely mesmerizing is Chris Thile. In all his manifestations, you know, Punch Brothers, Nickel Creek, the Goat Rodeo, oh my goodness, Live from Here. Anything featuring Chris Thile is just going to be worth $1 million. So this is a poem I have written called A Valetudinarian's Crisis in a Time of COVID-19. It's very playful. And it's for the progressive bluegrass of Punch Brothers, arranged in the old-fashioned way on a magic carpet around a single mighty mic. Punch Brothers are a group of 5 incredibly accomplished musicians, and they often simply go on the stage in a semicircle around one mighty mic, and they stand on a carpet square, of course, to control the music reverberations and feedback and all that sort of stuff. And to have this group on this magic carpet around this magic mighty mic, just the minimalism of it, the simplicity, and the sound that these musicians create, oh my goodness. American bluegrass is breathtaking. My Billy Blue, in fact, was named after the great American bluegrass performer, Billy Strings. Billy Blue's name is a tribute to Billy Strings. I love American bluegrass music. So here's my poem, A Valetudinarian's Crisis in a Time of COVID-19. I am indebted in lockdown more than ever to my partner safe at home, but also more a cock on the lookout, whose ensemble overdrive is measured in teaspoons of Vegemite or crushed garlic, or in mugs of strong black coffee, hiding the bottle of pre-noon comeuppance that makes bearable the reels and jigs of perfidy and moonshine, soaked up in a sofa's distressed leather. I am unshaven, daggy, in worn black and grey tracksuit and wholly woolen socks, shying away from the world, dog-tied from that damned earworm jingle, what I have become. I wish to look at home in check or plaid or flannel, to be practised with power tools and solvents whilst commiserating in a convivial evening's hops of Goldenberg, or amidst other such booze-soaked hymns. But all I now get is an empty inbox as I turn over and over to Punch Brothers Punch with care. I have a problem with grog. All right. Thank you for this wonderful tag, Robert G. Reader of Books, and Alan and David for tagging me to take part in the fun. I'll tag some people down below. Thank you for tuning in and stopping by. Thank you, and bye for now.